The hijackers' plan was flawless. Take control during meal service. When passengers were distracted, force the pilots to divert to their chosen location, and disappear before authorities could respond. There was just one problem. Their intelligence was wrong. They thought they were hijacking a plane full of civilians. They didn't know that retired Special Operations legend Robert Kane was in seat 14C. And he wasn't planning to be anyone's hostage. When the flight attendant asked Robert Kane if he wanted the chicken or pasta, he chose chicken. When the hijacker pointed a gun at his head an hour later, Kane chose violence, because after 25 years of Delta Force operations, some choices become instinct, and some passengers are exactly the wrong people to threaten at 30. Welcome to another incredible story where the wrong person met the wrong enemy at exactly the right time. Before we dive into this high-altitude thriller, tell me in the comments, what would you do in an emergency situation? And if you believe that heroes come in all disguises, hit that subscribe button. These stories of unexpected courage need to be told. At 48 years old, Robert "Ghost" Kane looked like any other business traveler settling into seat 14C of United Airlines Flight 87-1. His graying hair was neatly trimmed, his clothes unremarkable: khakis, polo shirt, and a worn leather jacket that had seen better days. To the casual observer, he appeared to be exactly what his boarding pass suggested: a consultant heading to Los Angeles for a routine business meeting. But appearances can be deceiving, especially when it comes to men like Robert Kane. For 25 years, Kane had been one of Delta Force's most effective operators. His call sign "Ghost" hadn't been earned through paperwork or training exercises. It came from his almost supernatural ability to appear and disappear in hostile territory without leaving a trace. From the mountains of Afghanistan to the urban warfare zones of Iraq, Kane had conducted over 200 classified missions, most of which would never appear in any official record. His retirement in 2019 had been quiet, just the way he preferred it. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a handshake from his commanding officer, and a transition to civilian life that felt both liberating and strangely empty. For 2 years, Kane had been adjusting to a world where his most dangerous decision was choosing which coffee shop to visit. That was about to change in a very dramatic way. Kane wasn't supposed to be on Flight 87-1. His original booking had been on Flight 6063 to Denver, where he was planning to visit his daughter Sarah and meet his grandson for the first time. But a last-minute gate change due to mechanical problems had automatically rebooked him on the Los Angeles flight, with a connection to Denver the following morning. As Kane settled into his aisle seat and accepted the flight attendant's offer of a pre-flight beverage, he had no idea that 4 men scattered throughout the aircraft were conducting final preparations for what they believed would be a routine hijacking operation. The hijacking had been planned with meticulous attention to detail. The 4-man team, led by a former Syrian military officer named Hassan Mahmoud, had spent 6 months studying Flight 87-1's schedule, crew rotations, and passenger patterns. They had identified this particular flight as ideal for their purposes: a cross-country route with minimal security presence, and a passenger manifest consisting primarily of business travelers and tourists. Their intelligence was comprehensive and accurate. They knew that the aircraft, a Boeing 737-800, would be carrying 142 passengers and 6 crew members. They had studied the plane's layout, identified the most vulnerable points in the security protocol, and even researched the background of Captain Jennifer Walsh and her crew. What they didn't know was that their intelligence was exactly 24 hours out of date. Hassan Mahmoud, the operations leader, was seated in 7A, close enough to the cockpit to move quickly when the signal came. His 3 associates were positioned strategically throughout the cabin: Yusuf al-Rashid in 12F, Omar Sid in 23B, and the youngest member of the team, Kareem Hassan, in seat 31C near the rear exit. Each man carried items that appeared innocent to security screening but could be quickly assembled into effective weapons: ceramic components hidden in laptops, chemical compounds disguised as medication, and improvised blades crafted from materials available on any commercial aircraft. Their plan called for taking control during meal service, approximately 90 minutes into the flight when passengers would be relaxed and distracted. Hassan would neutralize the flight attendants while his associates secured the passenger cabin. They estimated the entire takeover would require less than 3 minutes. The flight was then to be diverted to a small airfield in Nevada, where additional team members would be waiting with transportation and equipment necessary for the next phase of their operation. By the time authorities could respond effectively, the hijackers and their hostages would have vanished into a network of safe houses that had taken years to establish. It was a solid plan, professionally conceived and carefully executed. There was just one variable they hadn't accounted for: Robert Kane. As Flight 87 Fun reached cruising altitude, Kane found himself doing what came naturally, observing his environment with the systematic attention to detail that had kept him alive through a quarter-century of dangerous missions. It wasn't paranoia. It was simply how his mind worked after years of training that had made situational awareness as automatic as breathing. The first thing he noticed was the passenger in 7A. The man appeared relaxed, reading a magazine and occasionally glancing out the window, but Kane's experienced eye caught subtle indicators that suggested otherwise. The passenger's posture was too controlled, his breathing too measured, and most tellingly, his eyes moved in scanning patterns rather than the random movements of a casual observer. The second anomaly was the passenger in This man was pretending to sleep, but Kane could see that his breathing wasn't consistent with actual rest. Moreover, his hand position suggested he was maintaining contact with something concealed in his jacket pocket. By the time meal service began, Kane had identified all 4 suspicious passengers and noted the tactical significance of their positioning. They had established overlapping fields of control throughout the cabin, with clear sight lines to the cockpit, exits, and high-value areas like the galley where flight attendants prepared meals. Kane's assessment was professional and dispassionate. These men were conducting final preparations for a coordinated assault on the aircraft. Most passengers would have reported their suspicions to the flight crew, creating a situation that could escalate unpredictably. But Kane wasn't most passengers. His training had taught him that premature action often created more problems than it solved. Instead, he decided to wait and see how the situation developed, while quietly preparing for multiple contingencies. When the flight attendant offered him a choice between chicken and pasta, Kane chose chicken. He ate slowly, maintaining the appearance of a relaxed passenger while mentally rehearsing response scenarios for each of the threats he had identified. He didn't have to wait long. The attack began at exactly 1:47 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, approximately 90 minutes into the flight as the aircraft crossed into Nevada airspace. Hassan Mahan made the first move, standing abruptly as a flight attendant passed his row and grabbing her arm with one hand while producing a ceramic blade with the other. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hassan announced in accented but clear English, "this aircraft is now under our control. Remain in your seats and you will not be harmed." The reaction in the cabin was immediate and predictable. Some passengers screamed, others fumbled for their phones, and many simply froze in shock. The flight attendant Hassan had tried to activate the emergency call button, but his grip prevented her from reaching the device. Simultaneously, Hassan's 3 associates revealed their weapons and took control of their respective sections of the cabin. Yusuf al-Rashid moved toward the cockpit, while Omar Said and Karim Hassan began herding passengers away from the exit areas. It was a textbook hijacking, executed with the precision that comes from extensive planning and professional training. Within 90 seconds, the hijackers had effective control of the aircraft and its 40, but they had made one critical error. They had assumed that all of their hostages were civilians. Kane remained seated during the initial takeover, maintaining the appearance of a shocked and compliant passenger. His outward demeanor suggested fear and confusion, but internally he was conducting a tactical assessment with the cold precision that had made him legendary within the special operations community. The hijackers' weapons were improvised, but effective. Their positioning was professional. Their coordination suggested extensive training and experience. These weren't amateur terrorists or desperate criminals. They were skilled operators conducting a planned mission. However, Kane also identified several vulnerabilities in their approach. Their confidence had made them slightly careless, and their assumption that they faced no organized resistance had led them to spread their forces too thin across the aircraft. Most importantly, They had no idea that one of their hostages possessed the skills and experience necessary to turn their carefully planned operation into a disaster. The confrontation began when Karim Hassan, the youngest member of the terrorist team, decided to make an example of a passenger who had been slow to comply with order. Hassan approached row 14, where Kane was sitting, apparently having identified him as someone who might pose a leadership threat among the hostages. "You," Hassan said in heavily accented English, pointing his improvised blade at Kane's chest. "Stand up. Face the other passengers." Kane looked up slowly, his expression showing exactly the right mixture of fear and confusion that Hassan expected to see. "Please," Kane said, his voice trembling slightly. "I have a family. I don't want any trouble." Hassan smiled, interpreting Kane's apparent fear as confirmation that the passenger presented no threat. This was exactly the kind of submission that would reinforce the hijackers' control over the other hostages. "You will do exactly what I tell you," Hassan continued, pressing the ceramic blade against Kane's throat. "Or you will die, and your family will never see you again." Kane nodded rapidly, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. To every observer in the cabin, he appeared to be a terrified middle-aged businessman completely dominated by his captor. Hassan turned slightly to address the other passengers, intending to use Kane as a visible example of the consequences of resistance. "See how easy it is to obey," he announced. "This man understands that his life depends on." Hassan never finished the sentence. Kane's response was so fast that most witnesses later disagreed about exactly what they had seen. In a single fluid motion, Kane grabbed Hassan's wrist, twisted the blade away from his throat, and drove his elbow into the terrorist's solar plexus with enough force to lift him off his feet. Hassan crumpled to the aircraft floor, gasping for air and temporarily paralyzed by the precision strike. Before he could recover, Kane had relieved him of his weapon and was already moving toward the next threat. What happened next transformed Flight 87-1 from a terrorist operation into a demonstration of why Delta Force operators are considered among the most dangerous individuals on the planet. Kane's assault on Karim Hassan had been silent enough to avoid immediate detection by the other hijackers, but he knew that advantage would last only seconds. Omar said, positioned near the middle of the aircraft, was already turning to investigate the disturbance in row 14. Kane moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of close-quarters combat. As Omar raised his weapon and opened his mouth to shout a warning, Kane was already there, covering 20 feet of aisle space with a speed that seemed impossible in the confined aircraft cabin. The encounter lasted less than 3 seconds. Kane's hand closed over Omar's mouth, preventing any outcry, while his other hand applied pressure to a specific point on the terrorist's neck. Omar's eyes rolled back and he collapsed unconsciously to the floor, his improvised weapon clattering harmlessly away. 2 down, 2 to go. But Kane's assault had not gone completely unnoticed. Hassan Mahmoud, still near the cockpit, caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision and turned to see one of his team members lying motionless in the aisle. His tactical training immediately told him that the operation was compromised and that they were facing an organized counterattack. "Yusuf," Hassan shouted to his associate who was attempting to breach the cockpit door. "We have a problem." The warning came too late. Kane was already moving forward through the cabin, using passenger seats as cover while stalking his next target. Yusuf al-Rashid spun away from the cockpit door just in time to see Kane emerging from behind row 9, moving with the predatory focus of a natural killer. Yusuf was an experienced fighter, a veteran of conflicts in Syria and Iraq, who had survived situations that killed lesser men. But he had never faced anyone like Robert Kane. The battle for control of Flight 87-1's forward cabin became a deadly game of cat and mouse, played out in an environment where a single stray bullet could cause catastrophic decompression. Kane understood this limitation and used it to his advantage, employing techniques that eliminated threats without compromising the aircraft's structural integrity. Yusuf al-Rashid had positioned himself near the galley area, using the service card as cover while he attempted to coordinate with Hassan Mahmoud. Both men were now aware that they faced a serious threat, but neither fully understood the nature of what they were dealing with. "Who is this man?" Yusuf hissed into his radio, speaking rapid Arabic. Hassan's response was tense and urgent. "Unknown," professional training. Eliminate him immediately. But eliminating Robert Kane was easier ordered than accomplished. Kane approached the galley area, using a combination of stealth and misdirection that made him nearly invisible despite the confined space. He moved during moments when the aircraft's engine noise peaked, using sound masking to cover his approach. He exploited blind spots created by the galley's configuration and passenger seat angles. Most importantly, he used the hijackers' own tactical doctrine against them. They had been trained to expect resistance from panicked civilians, not from someone who understood their methods and could anticipate their responses. When Kane finally struck, Yusuf barely had time to register the threat before finding himself in a chokehold that cut off both his air supply and blood flow to his brain. The terrorist struggled frantically, but Kane's grip was positioned with surgical precision, and Yusuf's resistance faded within seconds. 3 down, 1 to go. Hassan Mahmoud now found himself in a position that his training had never prepared him for. In less than 5 minutes, his carefully planned operation had been systematically dismantled by a single passenger who seemed to anticipate his every move. But Hassan was a survivor, a professional who had adapted to changing circumstances in a dozen different combat environments. If he couldn't complete the original mission, he could at least ensure that his failure came at a significant cost. Hassan Mahmoud's last resort was both desperate and potentially catastrophic. Unable to control the passenger cabin and with his team eliminated, he decided to force entry into the cockpit and threaten the flight crew directly. If he could gain control of the aircraft's controls, he might still be able to complete some version of his mission. The cockpit door of a Boeing 737 is designed to withstand significant force, but Hassan had come prepared for this contingency. From his carry-on bag, he produced components that could be quickly assembled into a small explosive charge, enough to breach the door without causing structural damage to the aircraft. Kane recognized the threat immediately. A cockpit breach would put the flight crew at risk and could potentially result in loss of control of the aircraft. With 48 people aboard, the stakes couldn't be higher. But the narrow aisle leading to the cockpit created a tactical problem. Hassan was positioned where he could see Kane's approach from either direction, and the confined space limited Kane's options for a surprise attack. The solution required Kane to do something that went against every instinct developed during his military career. He made himself visible to the enemy. Hassan, Kane called out, using the terrorist's real name to get his attention. "We need to talk." Hassan spun around, his expression showing shock that this unknown passenger knew his identity. "Who are you?" he demanded, his weapon trained on Kane's center mass. Kane stepped into full view, his hands raised but his posture radiating quiet confidence. "Someone who knows exactly what you're planning, and why it's not going to work." For a moment Hassan hesitated. This passenger's demeanor was unlike anything he had encountered before. There was no fear, no desperation, just calm professional assessment. "You are military," Hassan said, recognizing something in Kane's bearing that civilians didn't possess. "Was," Kane replied simply. "But some things you never forget." What followed was a conversation conducted at gunpoint between two professionals who understood violence and its consequences. Hassan kept his weapon trained on Kane, while trying to determine whether this unexpected opponent represented a manageable threat or a game-changing problem. "Your team is finished," Kane said conversationally. "All 3 of them are alive but unconscious. No permanent damage, because I'm not in the business of killing people unless I have to." Hassan's eyes flicked briefly toward the passenger cabin, confirming what Kane had already suspected. The terrorist leader couldn't see his fallen associates from his current position. "You're lying," Hassan said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Kane shrugged. "Check for yourself. But while you're doing that, think about this. I took out 3 armed men in under 5 minutes without any weapons except what I learned in 25 years of special operations. What do you think happens when I decide you're too dangerous to leave standing?" The psychological pressure was deliberate and calculated. Kane was using Hassan's own tactical awareness against him, forcing the terrorist to consider scenarios that undermined his confidence and decision-making ability. Hassan's training told him to maintain aggression and press his advantage, but his experience whispered that this situation had moved beyond his control the moment Kane had revealed himself. "What do you want?" Hassan asked, his weapon still trained on Kane, but his posture subtly defensive. I want you to put down your weapon, step away from that cockpit door, and let me take you into custody until we land in Los Angeles. No one else gets hurt, and you live to see tomorrow." Hassan laughed, but the sound was forced and unconvincing. "You think I will surrender to one man?" Kane's expression didn't change. "I think you're going to surrender because you're smart enough to recognize when you're beaten, and because the alternative is that I take that weapon away from you, and you don't want to find out how that process works." The standoff lasted exactly 47 seconds, though it felt much longer to the passengers who could see the confrontation unfolding. Hassan Mahmoud was caught between his training, which demanded that he fight to the end, and his survival instincts, which recognized that he was facing an opponent unlike any he had encountered before. Kane waited patiently, understanding that psychological pressure often succeeded where physical force failed. He could see Hassan's internal struggle, the calculation of odds and outcomes that every professional fighter learned to make under stress. The deciding factor came when Hassan realized that Kane had maneuvered him into a position where his only escape route led directly past his opponent. Whether intentionally or not, Kane had created a tactical situation where Hassan's options were surrender or a close-quarters battle that he was unlikely to win. "You were special forces," Hassan said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Delta Force," Kane confirmed. 25 years. And your Syrian military, probably Republican Guard before you went freelance." Hassan's surprise at Kane's accurate assessment was visible. "How do you know this?" Kane smiled grimly. "Because I've fought against men trained by your system before. You're good, but you're not good enough to take on a passenger plane full of civilians and one very pissed-off American operator." The conversation was interrupted by a voice from the cockpit's intercom system. Captain Jennifer Walsh had been monitoring the situation through the aircraft's internal cameras and had decided to intervene. "This is Captain Walsh," to the passenger confronting the hijacker. "This is your aircraft commander. Do you need assistance?" Kane keyed the emergency call button without taking his eyes off Hassan. "Captain, this is Passenger Kane and 14C. Situation is under control. 4 hostiles neutralized, 1 remaining. Request you maintain course to LAX and alert authorities for passenger pickup on arrival." "Copy that, Mr. Kane. We show emergency vehicles standing by at LAX. ETA 17 minutes. Hassan's expression showed the final collapse of his hopes. The mission was over. His team was captured and he was facing either surrender or certain defeat. Hassan Mahmoud's surrender came not with dramatic flourishes, but with the quiet resignation of a professional who recognized when he had been outmaneuvered. He slowly lowered his weapon, placed it on the floor, and stepped back with his hands raised. "You win," he said simply. Kane approached carefully, still ready for treachery, but Hassan's body language suggested genuine capitulation. Within moments, Kane had secured the terrorist leader using improvised restraints fashioned from passenger seatbelts, while flight attendants worked to revive and restrain the other 3 hijackers. The transformation in the aircraft's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Passengers who had spent the last 20 minutes in terror began to understand that they were safe. Some wept with relief, others applauded, and many simply sat in stunned silence as they processed what they had witnessed. Kane found himself surrounded by grateful passengers and crew members, all asking questions about his background and how he had managed to single-handedly defeat 4 armed terrorists. His responses were polite but brief. He preferred to let his actions speak for themselves. Captain Walsh emerged from the cockpit to personally thank Kane for his intervention. "Mr. Kane, I've been flying for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. You saved every life on this aircraft." Kane shook her hand but seemed uncomfortable with the praise. "Just glad I was in the right place at the right time, Captain." But the captain's assessment was shared by everyone who had witnessed the events. In less than 15 minutes, Robert Kane had transformed from an anonymous passenger into the hero of Flight 871. Flight 871 landed at Los Angeles International Airport with an escort of FBI agents, federal marshals, and anti-terrorism specialists, who took custody of the 4 captured hijackers. The aircraft was immediately surrounded by emergency vehicles and law enforcement personnel, who had been monitoring the situation since Captain Walsh's initial report. Kane found himself at the center of intensive debriefings as federal agents worked to understand exactly what had happened at 35,000 feet. His military background was quickly verified, and his account of events was corroborated by passenger testimonies and the aircraft's internal security cameras. "Mr. Kane," said FBI Special Agent Sarah Martinez during one of several interviews, "preliminary analysis suggests that this hijacking was part of a larger terrorist network. Your actions may have prevented a significant attack on American soil." The investigation revealed that Hassan Mahmoud's team had been planning to use Flight 87-1 as part of a coordinated assault involving multiple aircraft. Intelligence gathered from the captured terrorists led to arrests in 3 other cities, effectively dismantling a network that had been developing plans for over 2 years. The passengers of Flight 87-1 were released after brief interviews, but many made a point of thanking Kane personally before leaving the airport. Several exchanged contact information and insisted that he stay in touch. Bonds formed during life-and-death situations tend to last a lifetime. Kane's daughter Sarah flew to Los Angeles the following day, bringing his grandson for their delayed reunion. "Dad," she said as she hugged him in the airport terminal, "Mom used to tell me stories about your military service, but I never really understood what that meant until today." Kane smiled and picked up his 2-year-old grandson, who was completely unaware that his grandfather had just prevented a terrorist attack. "Some stories are better left as stories, sweetheart." The media attention surrounding Flight 87-1 was immediate and intense. Within hours, Kane found himself fielding interview requests from every major news network, though he declined most opportunities to tell his story publicly. The few interviews he did grant were characteristically modest. "I was a passenger who happened to have relevant training," he told CNN's Anderson Cooper. Any other Delta Force operator would have done the same thing. But his former colleagues in the special operations community saw the situation differently. Colonel James Patterson, Kane's former commanding officer, spoke at a Pentagon briefing about the incident. "Robert Kane's actions on Flight 87-1 represent the highest traditions of American military service. Even in retirement, he exemplified the values and skills that make our special operations forces the finest in the world." The White House issued a statement commending Kane's courage, and he was invited to receive a Civilian Valor Award from the president. The ceremony was private, held in the Oval Office with only Kane's immediate family present. "Mr. Kane," the president said during the brief ceremony, "your actions remind us that heroism doesn't require a uniform or official authorization. Sometimes it just requires one person willing to stand up when others need protection." Kane's response was typical. "Mr. President, I was just a passenger who got involved when the situation required it." The story of Flight 87-1 became a case study in aviation security, counter-terrorism training, and crisis management. The Federal Aviation Administration used Kane's actions as an example when developing new protocols for passenger involvement in security incidents. Airlines began discussions about identifying military and law enforcement personnel among their passengers, creating informal networks of trained individuals who could assist in emergency situations. While these programs remained largely classified, industry insiders confirmed that Kane's example had influenced policy at the highest levels. The Hijackers trial received significant media attention, with Hassan Mahmoud receiving multiple life sentences for terrorism, conspiracy, and attempted murder. During the proceedings, federal prosecutors used Kane's testimony to demonstrate the sophistication of the terrorist network and the seriousness of the threat they had posed. Kane returned to his quiet retirement, but found that his life had changed in subtle ways. He was regularly contacted by security consulting firms, airlines, and government agencies, seeking his expertise. While he declined most offers, he did agree to serve as an advisor to counter-terrorism training programs. "The thing about special operations," Kane told a group of FBI trainees during one of his rare speaking engagements, "is that it's not about being the toughest guy in the room. It's about being the most prepared, the most aware, and the most willing to act when action is required." One aspect of the Flight 87-1 incident that received less public attention was its psychological impact on the passengers who had witnessed Kane's intervention. Several travelers required counseling to process the trauma of the hijacking, even though it had ended without casualties. Kane made himself available to speak with any passenger who wanted to discuss their experience. These conversations were private and unrecorded, but they revealed a side of the retired operator that his military colleagues rarely saw. "I know what it's like to process violence," Kane told one passenger who was struggling with nightmares. "Even when you're trained for it, seeing it up close changes you. What's important is that everyone went home to their family." Sarah Kane, Robert's daughter, later said that watching her father help other passengers heal from their trauma taught her more about courage than all his military stories combined. "He could have just walked away after the hijacking was over," she explained, "but he stayed involved because he understood that his actions had affected other people, and he felt responsible for helping them deal with that." The flight crew of Flight 87-1 remained in contact with Kane for years afterward. Captain Walsh invited him to her retirement ceremony 5 years later, introducing him to her colleagues as the passenger who taught me that heroes really do exist. Today, Robert Kane continues to live quietly in retirement, though his story has become part of aviation lore. Flight 871 is studied in security training programs around the world as an example of how quickly a dangerous situation can be resolved when the right person is in the right place at the right time. When asked about his legacy, Kane typically deflects the question. "I was just a passenger who got involved," he insists. The real heroes were the flight crew who kept that aircraft safe, and the passengers who stayed calm under pressure. But those who know the details of what happened at 35,000 feet understand that Kane's humility, while admirable, doesn't diminish the significance of his action. In 15 minutes of carefully controlled violence, he had saved 148 lives and prevented what could have been a catastrophic terrorist attack. The story of Flight 8071 reminds us that heroism often comes disguised as ordinary people living ordinary lives. Robert Kane didn't board that aircraft planning to become a hero. He was just a father trying to visit his daughter and meet his grandson. But when circumstances demanded action, when innocent lives hung in the balance, Kane responded with the skill and courage that had defined his military career. He proved that some types of training never fade, that some commitments to service extend far beyond official duty, and that sometimes the most dangerous person on an aircraft is the one you'd least suspect. The hijackers of Flight 8071 made many mistakes during their operation, but their biggest error was assuming they understood their enemy. They thought they were dealing with civilians. They were wrong. Sometimes the quiet passenger in seat 14C is exactly the wrong person to threaten, and sometimes being wrong can change everything. So I ask you, have you ever been in a situation where someone stepped up when everyone else stepped back? Have you witnessed ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it? Because Flight 871 proves that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear polo shirts and baseball caps, and sometimes they're sitting right next to you. If this story of unexpected courage moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that heroes can emerge from anywhere. Subscribe to make sure you never miss stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it matters most. Remember, in a world where danger can strike anywhere, at any time, sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely sources, and sometimes the person sitting next to you on a flight has exactly the skills needed to keep everyone safe. The hijackers thought they had planned the perfect crime. They were right about everything except the most important detail. They picked the wrong flight.